My name is Daniel Harper. I was 37 years old in 1963, and I worked the night shift at the county hospital morgue in western Pennsylvania. I wasn't a doctor, and I wasn't a detective. I was the man who received the bodies after everyone else was finished with them. Most nights, my job was paperwork, refrigeration, and waiting, nothing more. Then, one Thursday in February, a sheriff's deputy brought me a man who had supposedly died in a car accident on Route 17. The ambulance arrived at 1:18 in the morning. The deputy handed me the paperwork, and I read the name, Robert Hayes, 52 years old, lost control on the ice. I signed the transfer form and pulled the body onto the examination table. His face had several cuts, but nothing unusual for a crash victim. Then I opened his shirt, and that's when I saw the scar. It ran from the middle of his chest toward his stomach, straight and clean, like someone had opened him up and carefully closed him again. I called the hospital doctor. Did Hayes have surgery? The doctor looked at the body. Not according to the report. I pointed at the scar. He didn't get this from a steering wheel. The doctor examined it for several seconds, then looked at me. Looks like abdominal surgery. When? I can't tell. I checked the man's medical file. There were no operations, no recent hospitalization, nothing that explained the scar. I went back to the deputy. You said this man died at the scene? Yes. Who treated him? Nobody. The ambulance crew pronounced him dead. I looked at the paperwork again. The time of death was listed as 11:40 p.m. The ambulance didn't reach the scene until 12:16. I pointed at the report. Why was the death recorded before the ambulance arrived? The deputy took the paper from my hand. Clerical mistake. That's a pretty specific mistake. He looked at me for a moment. Just finish your job, Harper. Then he left. I didn't. I went back to Hayes's file and searched the hospital records. 3 days earlier, Robert Hayes had been admitted to our hospital. The record said he complained of severe abdominal pain, stayed for several hours, and was then discharged. There was no doctor's signature, no discharge time, and no nurse's signature, nothing. Just one sentence typed at the bottom. Patient left in stable condition. I stared at it. A man who supposedly left the hospital 3 days earlier was now lying dead in my morgue with a surgical scar nobody could explain. At 3:05 in the morning, I found the old admission log. Hayes's name was there. So was another name from the same night, Samuel Price. I knew that name. Price had died 6 months earlier in a car accident, same county, same hospital. I pulled his old file and checked the autopsy report. No surgery was listed in his medical history, but the report mentioned a healed incision across his abdomen. I checked another case, then another. 3 men, 3 unexplained surgical scars, and 3 deaths that had been ruled accidents. I kept digging until I found something that made me stop. All 3 men had been patients at our hospital within the same 6-month period. And all 3 files had been signed by the same doctor. Dr. Walter Mason. I knew Mason well. Everybody did. He was the senior physician on the night staff, and he had worked at the hospital for almost 20 years. At 4:10 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside the morgue. The door opened, and Dr. Mason walked in. He looked at Hayes's body, then looked at me. You're still working? I found something strange. He didn't ask what. He walked straight to the table and pulled the sheet over Hayes's face. I said, "Did you operate on him?" Mason stopped. "No, did you know he was admitted 3 days ago?" He looked at me. For the first time, I saw something different in his expression, not surprise, but fear. "Daniel," he said quietly, "forget you ever saw that scar." Then he walked out. I stood alone in the morgue. I looked at Hayes's body again. For 7 years, I had worked around dead people without being afraid of them. That morning, for the first time, I realized the dead weren't the ones I needed to worry about. I didn't forget the scar. I went home at 7 that morning, slept for 3 hours, then came back before my shift started. I had spent the entire afternoon thinking about Dr. Mason. He hadn't denied operating on Hayes, he had simply told me to forget the scar, and that bothered me more than an outright confession would have. At 8:30 that night, I went to the records room and pulled every file with Mason's signature from the previous 3 years. There were dozens, so I narrowed them down to patients who had died unexpectedly. 9 names. 5 had died in car accidents, 2 from supposed heart attacks, 1 had drowned, and another had been found dead in his apartment. I checked their autopsy reports, and 4 of them had the same surgical scar. Every one of those patients had been admitted to our hospital shortly before they died, and every one had been discharged without a proper signature. The pattern was always the same: admission, several missing hours in the records, an unexplained discharge, then death somewhere outside the hospital. I copied the names onto a sheet of paper and went downstairs. I checked the storage area behind the body refrigerators, where the hospital kept old records. The hospital had been renovated in 1958, but the original morgue was still behind a locked door. I found the key hanging in the maintenance office. The door opened with a loud metallic scrape. The room smelled of dust and old disinfectant. There were examination tables, broken cabinets, and stacks of old records. I started searching. 20 minutes later, I found a metal cabinet hidden behind a shelf. The lock had been forced open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Dead patients lying on examination tables. I recognized several faces from the files. Then I found Robert Hayes. The photograph showed him alive. He was lying on an operating table, his abdomen exposed, and Dr. Mason was standing beside him. I dropped the photograph. There was another person in the picture. Charles Whitmore, the hospital administrator. I kept searching and found photographs of 6 other patients. All had undergone the same procedure, and none of it appeared in their records. Beside the photographs was a black notebook. Each page contained a name, a date, and a number. The numbers were dates of death. The final page had only one name, Robert Hayes. Beside it was written, "Transfer complete, February 14th. I checked the calendar. It was February 14th. Then I heard the old morgue door close behind me. I turned. Dr. Mason was standing there. He looked at the photographs. "You shouldn't have come in here." I held one up. "What did you do to these people?" He didn't answer. "Why were they operated on?" He finally looked at me. "They weren't supposed to die." "That's your explanation?" "No," he looked exhausted. "They were witnesses." "To what?" Mason walked toward the cabinet. "Years ago, Whitmore and several businessmen in this county started using the hospital to move stolen narcotics. The patients found out. Some of them did. And you? I tried to help them. You operated on them. I removed evidence from their bodies, bullets, fragments, anything that could connect them to the people responsible. Then why did they all die?" Mason didn't answer. I already knew the answer. Someone was finishing the job after they left the hospital. Before I could ask another question, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mason looked toward the door. "Hide." "What? Now?" I moved behind the cabinet. The door opened. Charles Whitmore entered, carrying a folder. Mason stood between him and the photographs. Whitmore looked around the room. "Where's Harper?" My heart stopped. Mason said nothing. Whitmore smiled. Daniel has been asking too many questions. He placed the folder on the table. I think we should solve that problem tonight. Then he opened it. Inside was my hospital file, my home address, and a photograph of me leaving the hospital that morning. Whitmore looked at Mason. After all these years, I really thought we'd have to worry about a detective. He tapped the photograph. But apparently, all we needed was a morgue attendant. Then Mason said something I never expected. You're not killing him. I'm not. No, Mason reached inside his coat. Whitmore immediately stepped backward. Mason was holding a small tape recorder. He pressed the button. Whitmore's own voice filled the room. I think we should solve that problem tonight. Whitmore's face changed. For the first time, he looked scared. Then the lights went out. Someone had cut the power. I heard a gunshot. Then another. Glass shattered somewhere beside me. I crawled toward the door. When the emergency lights came on, Mason was lying on the floor. Whitmore was gone. And the folder containing my name was still sitting on the table. I picked it up. There was one final document inside. A death certificate. My name was already printed at the top. The date of death was tomorrow. I stood there holding my own death certificate, and for several seconds I couldn't move. The date was February 15, 1963, tomorrow. I looked at Mason, but he was still lying on the floor. I checked his pulse. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps outside the morgue. I grabbed the folder and ran through the back door. The hallway was dark, and someone was moving behind me. I reached the security office and shook the night guard awake. Call the police. What's happened? Someone shot Dr. Mason. He reached for the telephone, then the hospital lights came back on. A nurse screamed from the corridor. I ran toward her. Mason was standing there, alive. His white coat was covered in blood, but there wasn't a bullet wound on him. He looked at me. Don't say anything. I followed him into an empty examination room. What happened? The blood wasn't mine. Whose was it? Hayes. My stomach tightened. You're telling me Robert Hayes was alive? He was never supposed to be dead. Mason explained that Hayes had discovered Whitmore's operation years earlier. Whitmore had Hayes brought back to the hospital and ordered Mason to remove a bullet fragment from his body. Mason operated on him, then helped fake his death so Hayes could disappear. But Hayes never reached the safe house, and 3 days later, his body appeared on Route 17. I asked Mason who killed him. I don't know. Then why was he in the morgue? Because someone wanted us to believe he was dead. I remembered the scar, the missing records, and the death certificate. Everything made sense except one thing. Why is my name on that certificate? Mason went silent. I opened the folder again. There was another document underneath the death certificate. It was an old patient record with my name across the top. Daniel Harper. The date was 1948. I've never been a patient here. You were. I was 22. No, he looked at me. You were 6. I felt cold. Mason opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. A little boy was lying on an operating table, his face covered with blood. I looked closer. The boy was me. What happened? You were brought here after a factory accident. My father never worked at a factory. Your father wasn't the one who brought you here. Who was? Mason looked directly into my eyes. You died that night. I stepped backward. No, your heart stopped, and the doctors couldn't bring you back. Then who am I? Mason looked toward the door. That is what Whitmore has been trying to find out for 15 years. Before I could respond, someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. Mason froze. The knocking came again. I opened the door. Nobody was there. A hospital gurney stood in the hallway, a sheet covering the body. I pulled it back. Charles Whitmore was lying underneath. Dead. A bullet wound was visible in his chest. I looked at Mason. You said he was in his office. He was. A piece of paper was pinned to Whitmore's coat. I pulled it free. Only one sentence was written on it. You should have left the dead alone. I looked up. Mason was gone. I ran back toward the morgue. The refrigerator door was open. Drawer number 6 had been pulled out. Robert Hayes was inside. I stared at his face. His eyes opened. He grabbed my wrist. Don't trust Mason. I pulled him from the drawer. Who are you? My name isn't Robert Hayes. Then who are you? He stared at me. Daniel Harper. I couldn't breathe. He looked older than me, but the resemblance was impossible to ignore. That was me, he said, pointing at the photograph. In 1948, I died on that operating table. My hand started shaking. Then who am I? He looked toward the morgue entrance. Your father couldn't accept losing his son. He lowered his voice. They used my medical records, my identity, and another child's body. I stared at him. You're saying I'm not Daniel Harper? He nodded. You're the replacement. Then we heard sirens outside. The police are here. No, he grabbed my arm. They're here for you. The morgue door opened. Dr. Mason stood there holding the black notebook. He looked at Hayes, then at me. I was hoping you'd never remember. Another voice came from behind him. Neither was I. I turned. My father was standing in the doorway. I hadn't seen him since I was 18. He was supposed to have been dead for 20 years. He looked at me without emotion. Daniel. Then he stepped closer. You were never supposed to remember who you were. My name is Frank Miller, and in 1971, I worked the overnight desk at St. Vincent County Hospital in Ohio. My job was simple: answer the phones, sign delivery papers, direct the night staff, and keep track of anyone coming through the main entrance after midnight. I had worked there for almost 9 years, and I knew the building better than most people. At least, I thought I did. One night in November, around 2:15 a.m., I heard a loud bang from beneath the basement floor. I was sitting alone at the reception desk when the sound came again. 3 heavy knocks. I called maintenance, but nobody answered. So I took a flashlight and went downstairs. The basement was almost empty at night, and the only light came from the small bulbs above the storage rooms. I followed the sound to the old laundry area. There was a metal door I had never noticed before. It had no sign, no handle on the outside, and a chain wrapped around it. The chain was loose. I pulled it away. The door opened. Behind it was a narrow staircase going down. I stood there for several seconds, trying to remember whether that part of the hospital had ever existed. It hadn't. I started down. The air became colder with every step. At the bottom, I found another door. This one had a small glass window. I wiped the dust away and looked inside. There were 6 metal tables. My stomach tightened. It was a morgue. But St. Vincent already had a morgue on the first basement level. I opened the door. The room smelled strongly of disinfectant. There were 4 body drawers along the wall, and 3 of them were occupied. I checked the first drawer. A woman was inside, maybe in her 60s. I looked at the tag attached to her wrist. The name was Margaret Collins. I had never heard of her. I checked the second drawer. A man, around 40 years old. His tag read Thomas Reed. The third body was a young man. His tag read David Harris. I walked over to the desk in the corner. There were folders stacked neatly beside an old telephone. I opened the first one. Margaret Collins. Date of death, November 12, 1971. I checked the hospital system in my notebook. There was no admission record. I opened Thomas Reed's file. Same thing. No admission. No treatment. No discharge. No ambulance record. Nothing. I opened David Harris's file. His name wasn't anywhere in the hospital records either. I started checking the other folders. Every file belonged to someone who had supposedly died inside our hospital. But none of them had ever been admitted. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Nobody was there. Then the telephone on the desk rang. I nearly dropped the file. I picked up the receiver. A man's voice said, "You shouldn't be down there." I asked who he was. He didn't answer. I heard breathing. Then the line went dead. I immediately ran upstairs. When I reached the reception desk, the night supervisor was standing there. He looked at me. "Where were you?" I told him about the room. His expression changed. "What room?" "The second morgue." He stared at me for several seconds. Then he said something I'll never forget. "There is no second morgue." I told him what I'd seen. The bodies. The files. The telephone. He walked downstairs with me. We reached the laundry area. The metal door was gone. There was only a concrete wall. I stood there staring at it. That can't be right. My supervisor didn't answer. He just walked away. I went back to the reception desk and tried to convince myself I had imagined everything. Then I noticed something sitting beside the telephone. A folder. I picked it up. The name on the front was mine. Frank Miller. Inside was my photograph. My employment record. My home address. And one line typed across the bottom. Date of death, November 19, 1971. I looked at the calendar. It was November 18th. I didn't sleep that morning. I stayed home until sunset, staring at the folder I'd taken from the basement. My name was printed on the front, my photograph was inside, and the date of death was tomorrow. At 9 p.m., I went back to St. Vincent. I didn't tell my supervisor what I had found. I went straight to the records room and searched for Margaret Collins, Thomas Reed, and David Harris. None of them existed in the system. Then I found something strange. All 3 names appeared in an old ambulance log from 1969. The entries were handwritten, and beside each name was the same note, transferred below. I checked the basement floor plan. There was no lower level. At least, there wasn't supposed to be. I pulled the oldest blueprint I could find. The original plans showed a second basement beneath the laundry area. It had been sealed during construction in 1954. I stared at the drawing. There was a staircase exactly where I'd found the hidden door. Someone had removed the lower level from every newer blueprint. I went downstairs again. The metal door was still gone. I ran my hands along the concrete wall, searching for anything unusual. Then I felt a small metal plate beneath the paint. I scraped it with my pocket knife. A keyhole appeared. I found an old key inside the maintenance office and tried it. The wall clicked. A narrow section opened inward. The staircase was still there. I went down. This time, the lights were on. The second morgue looked exactly as I remembered it. Except there were more bodies. 6 drawers were occupied. I opened the first one. Margaret Collins. The second was Thomas Reed. The third was David Harris. The other 3 were strangers. I checked their tags. All 6 had died within the previous 2 weeks. None had hospital records. I returned to the desk and opened the black ledger. There were hundreds of names inside. Some dated back to the 1950s. Every name had a date of death and a location. But besides several names was the same word. Transferred. I turned the page. The next name was mine. Frank Miller. My hand started shaking. Beside my name was tomorrow's date. Underneath it was written, Basement 2. Then I heard the elevator moving. There was no elevator in the lower morgue. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped away from the desk. The doors at the far end opened. A man walked out wearing a white hospital coat. I recognized him immediately. Dr. Samuel Carter. He had been the hospital's chief surgeon in the 1950s. He had died in 1962. I stood frozen. He looked at me. You found it. I couldn't speak. You need to leave. Who are these people? He looked toward the body drawers. People who were never supposed to exist. What does that mean? He walked toward the ledger. Some of them died here. And the records? We removed them. Why? He looked at me. Because the hospital wasn't treating them. I waited. He continued. We were studying them. I felt sick. Studying what? Death. He opened a drawer and pulled out a file. These patients were brought here after being declared dead. You mean they were alive? Some were. And the others? He looked away. They were used to see how long a human body could remain functional after death. I stepped backward. You're telling me this hospital was experimenting on dead people? Not just dead people. He opened another drawer. Inside was a body with a surgical incision across the chest. Some of them were brought back. Who ran this? Carter didn't answer. Then I heard footsteps on the staircase. Carter immediately shut the drawer. Hide. I moved behind a storage cabinet. 3 men entered. They were wearing hospital uniforms. The first one was my supervisor. The second was the hospital administrator. The third man was someone I had never seen before. My supervisor looked around. Where is Miller? The administrator opened the ledger. He's already here. He pointed at my name. The third man smiled. Then tomorrow's schedule won't change. The administrator closed the ledger. Prepare the table. My supervisor looked nervous. What about the police? The third man laughed. There won't be a police report. They walked toward the examination tables. Carter quietly moved beside me. He whispered, when they turn off the lights, run. I nodded. The lights suddenly went out. I ran. I reached the staircase, but someone grabbed my coat. I turned. My supervisor was holding me. You weren't supposed to find this place. I fought him and broke free. I ran upstairs and slammed the door behind me. I reached the main reception desk and grabbed the telephone. I called the police. Before I could give them the address, I heard the basement door open behind me. I turned. My supervisor was standing at the end of the hallway. His face was covered in blood. He smiled. "You're going downstairs tomorrow, Frank." I stood at the reception desk with the telephone still in my hand. My supervisor was watching me from the end of the hallway. His face was covered in blood, but he wasn't injured. He slowly walked toward me. "Put the phone down, Frank." I didn't move. "I already called the police." He smiled. "No, you didn't." I looked at the telephone. The line was dead. He reached the desk and pulled the receiver from my hand. "You should have listened the first night." I backed away. "What happened to Dr. Carter?" My supervisor's expression changed. "He never existed." I stared at him. "I saw him." "You saw what they wanted you to see." He grabbed my arm. I fought him and ran toward the emergency exit. The door was locked. I turned around. He was gone. Then I heard the elevator bell. The doors opened behind me. Nobody was inside. I stepped closer. A small metal plate had been attached to the back wall. It read, "Basement 2." I pressed the button. The elevator doors closed. When they opened again, I was standing in the second morgue. The lights were off. I heard a body drawer sliding open. Then another. I switched on my flashlight. Every drawer was open. The bodies were gone. I walked toward the examination tables. Someone was sitting in the chair beside the black ledger. It was Dr. Carter. "You came back. Where are the bodies?" "They were moved." "Where?" "Upstairs." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Carter looked at the ledger. "They never wanted the bodies down here." "Then why keep them?" "Because this place was built for something else." He opened the ledger to the oldest page. There was a list of names from 1954. Beside every name was a time. Not a date. A time. "What are these?" "The exact moment each person stopped breathing." I looked at him. "Why record that?" "Because some of them started breathing again." I stepped backward. Carter continued. "The hospital discovered that certain patients could be revived after being clinically dead for several minutes. And they experimented on them." "Yes." "How many?" "Hundreds." I looked around the room. "Where are they now?" Carter pointed toward the ceiling. "Some went home." "And the others?" "They never woke up." I heard footsteps above us. Carter closed the ledger. "They're coming." "Who?" "The people who kept this place running." A metal door slammed somewhere behind us. Carter grabbed my arm. "There's another exit." We ran through a narrow corridor behind the examination room. At the end was a steel door. Carter unlocked it. The door opened into an old tunnel beneath the hospital. We moved quickly through the darkness. Behind us, someone shouted my name. "Frank." I kept running. We reached a stairwell that led outside. When I opened the door, cold air hit my face. We were behind the hospital. Police cars were parked near the emergency entrance. I started toward them. Carter grabbed my shoulder. "Don't." I turned. "What now?" He pointed toward the hospital. The entire building was being evacuated. Then I saw my supervisor walking out with the hospital administrator. Both were alive. Both were covered in blood. The police officers walked toward them. I thought it was over. Then an officer approached me. "Are you Frank Miller?" "Yes." He looked at the photograph in his hand. "I'm sorry." "For what?" He handed me the photograph. It showed my body lying on one of the morgue tables. The picture had been taken that night. I looked at Carter. He was gone. I turned back toward the hospital. Every light on the second floor suddenly went out. Then the basement lights came on. I could see through the small windows. 6 people were standing inside the old morgue. I recognized all of them. Margaret Collins, Thomas Reed, David Harris, and 3 others. They were the bodies I had seen the night I found the room. They were standing, watching me. The officer beside me suddenly grabbed my arm. "Don't look at them." "Why?" He lowered his voice. "Because nobody who sees them is supposed to leave this hospital." I looked back. The room was empty. The 6 people were gone. The next morning, St. Vincent County Hospital was closed. The newspapers reported an electrical fire in the basement. There was no mention of the hidden morgue. No mention of the bodies. No mention of Dr. Carter. And no mention of the files. I resigned that same day. I never went back. But 3 weeks later, a package arrived at my house. There was no return address. Inside was the black ledger. I opened it. The final page had been changed. My name was still there. But the date beside it was different. It wasn't tomorrow anymore. It was 20 years later. Underneath my name was a new sentence. Transfer delayed. I closed the book. Then I heard 3 knocks from inside my basement. I never opened that door. My name is Daniel Reed, and in 2009, I worked the overnight security shift at a psychiatric hospital in Pennsylvania. The hospital was old, the cameras were worse, and after midnight, most of the building felt completely abandoned. My job was simple: sit in the security room, watch the monitors, log anything unusual, and call the nurses if a patient left their room. Most nights were boring. That changed on October 17th. It was 2:13 in the morning when I noticed an old woman walking down corridor C. She was wearing a long gray hospital gown, white socks, and a dark cardigan. She walked slowly, holding one hand against the wall. I checked the camera number. C14. That hallway was supposed to be empty. I grabbed the radio and called the nurse station. "Do you have a patient in corridor C?" The nurse checked her list. "No, check again." "I already did, Daniel, there are no patients in that section." I looked back at the monitor. The woman had stopped walking. She was standing directly beneath the camera. Her head slowly lifted. She was looking straight into the lens. I grabbed my flashlight and left the security room. Corridor C was on the other side of the building. I walked past the locked patient wards, turned the corner, and reached the old hallway. The lights were off. I switched on my flashlight. Nobody was there. I checked every room. Empty. I called the nurse again. "She's gone." "Who?" "The old woman." There was a pause. "Daniel, what old woman?" I returned to the security room. The monitor showed the same hallway. Empty. I rewound the recording. The woman appeared at 2:11. She entered from the far end and walked toward the camera. At 2:13, she stopped. At 2:14, the screen went black for 3 seconds. When the picture returned, she was gone. I checked the other cameras. Nothing. Then I noticed something strange. Camera C15 showed the same hallway from another angle. I rewound that recording. The woman never appeared. She should have been visible for at least 20 seconds. Instead, she simply appeared beneath C14. I checked the camera time. It was correct. I checked the system logs. No power interruption. No camera malfunction. At 3 o'clock, I decided to search the hospital database. I typed in the description, elderly female, gray gown, dark cardigan. Nothing. Then I remembered the old paper records stored in the administration basement. I wasn't supposed to access them, but curiosity got the better of me. I found the psychiatric admissions files from the 1980s. After almost an hour, I found a photograph. I recognized the woman immediately. Same face. Same cardigan. Same eyes. Her name was Eleanor Price. She had been admitted in 1987. I checked the discharge record. There wasn't one. Instead, a handwritten note appeared beside her name. Deceased, October 17, 1989. I stared at the date. Exactly 20 years before I saw her on the camera. I kept reading. Eleanor had been a patient in the same section of the hospital. Corridor C. The same corridor I had just searched. I turned the page. There was another photograph. This one showed Eleanor sitting in a chair inside the security room. I froze. The photograph was dated 1989. Behind her was the exact same row of monitors I was watching. I looked at my screen. Camera C14 was still showing an empty hallway. Then the monitor flickered. Eleanor appeared again. This time she wasn't in corridor C. She was standing inside the security room. Behind me. I didn't turn around. I stared at the monitor and watched Eleanor standing behind my chair. She wasn't moving. I could see her face reflected faintly in the glass of the screen. I slowly reached for the radio. Then the image changed. The monitor showed an empty security room. I turned around. There was nobody there. I checked the door. Still locked. I looked back at the monitor. Eleanor was gone. I rewound the recording, but the footage showed nothing unusual. I decided to search the old records again. I found Eleanor's psychiatric file and started reading every page. She had been admitted in 1987 after telling doctors that she could see people who weren't supposed to be there. Her notes described the same thing repeatedly. She claimed that someone was watching her through the hospital cameras. The doctors considered it part of her condition. Then I found a handwritten report from 1989. It said Eleanor had become convinced that the cameras could see into the future. She refused to sleep anywhere without covering the lenses. 3 days later, she was found dead in her room. The official cause was heart failure. But the report contained something strange. The nurse who found her said every television monitor in the security room had turned on at exactly the same time, even though the security room had been empty. I closed the file. Then one of the monitors flickered. Camera C14. Eleanor was standing at the end of the hallway. This time, she was holding something. A small piece of paper. I zoomed in. The picture became blurry, but I could make out 2 words. Run now. I stood up. At that exact moment, I heard footsteps outside the security room. Slow footsteps. Someone was walking down the hallway. I grabbed the radio. Who is outside security? Nobody answered. The footsteps stopped. Then the door handle moved. I locked it. The handle moved again. I stepped away from the door. The monitors suddenly changed. Every camera showed the same hallway. Every screen showed Eleanor. She was standing closer now. On one screen, she was 10 feet away. On another, she was almost beside the camera. On the third, she was standing directly in front of the lens. Then all the screens went black. The door handle stopped moving. I waited. Nothing. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. I checked the nurse station. Nobody had seen anyone. I returned to the security room and searched the camera archives. The system only stored 30 days of footage, but the hospital still had old recordings on VHS tapes. I found a box labeled 1989. I inserted the first tape. The footage showed the same corridors, the same elevators, and the same security room. Then I saw Eleanor. She was sitting in front of the camera. I watched the timestamp. October 17, 1989. Exactly 20 years earlier. She looked directly at the camera. Her lips moved. I increased the volume. Her voice was weak, but I could hear her. The man watching me will be here soon. I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking. I rewound it and listened again. The sentence was clear. I checked the date on the tape. October 17, 1989. The same date as tonight. I searched the remaining tapes. There were dozens. On almost every one, Eleanor appeared somewhere in the hospital. Sometimes she was walking. Sometimes she was sitting. Sometimes she was standing in places that didn't exist anymore. Then I found the final tape. The label said, Security Room, October 17, 1989. I played it. The camera showed the security room. A younger security guard was sitting at the desk. I recognized him. It was my father. I hadn't seen him in 20 years. He was watching the monitors. Then Eleanor appeared behind him. My father turned around. She said something to him. The tape suddenly distorted. The screen went black. When the picture returned, my father was gone. I stared at the screen. Then the security room door behind me opened. I turned. Nobody was there. But the monitor showed something different. Eleanor was standing behind me again. This time, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking toward the open door. Then she slowly raised her hand and pointed. I followed her finger. Someone was standing at the end of the hallway. It was my father. I stared at the monitor, unable to breathe. My father was standing at the end of the hallway. He looked exactly as I remembered him from childhood, wearing the same dark security uniform he had worn before he disappeared in 1989. I ran out of the security room. The hallway was empty. I checked every door, every stairwell, every emergency exit. Nobody was there. Then my radio crackled. A woman's voice whispered, "Don't follow him." I froze. It was Eleanor. I looked at the monitor again. She was standing beside my father. He was staring directly at the camera. Then he pointed toward the security room. I ran back. The monitor had changed. My father was gone. Eleanor was standing alone. She raised one finger to her lips. Then the screen went black. I grabbed the old VHS tape from the machine and ran to the administration office. I needed to find out what happened to my father. I searched through the employee records until I found his file. Thomas Reed. Security officer. Employed from 1984 to 1989. Status, deceased. I stared at the word. My father had never been declared dead. My mother had always told me he disappeared. I opened the report. It said he had been found unconscious inside the hospital basement on October 18, 1989. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But the report had something written across the bottom in red ink. Body not recovered. I felt sick. Someone had reported him dead without ever recovering his body. I went back to the security room. The old VHS tape was still inside the machine. I pressed play. The recording showed my father sitting at the desk. Eleanor walked into the room. She placed something on the desk. It was a photograph. My father picked it up. He looked terrified. Then he turned toward the camera and said something. I increased the volume. That's my son. My heart stopped. The recording had been made 20 years before I started working there. I watched as my father pointed at the camera. Then Eleanor looked directly into the lens. She spoke slowly. He'll come back. The tape ended. I sat there in silence. Then the phone rang. I answered. Nobody spoke. I heard breathing. Then my father's voice. Daniel. I couldn't move. Dad. There was a long silence. Leave the hospital. Where are you? I'm downstairs. Where? Basement 2. The line went dead. I grabbed my flashlight and ran downstairs. The door to the old basement was already open. I walked down the stairs. The air became colder. At the bottom, the second morgue was empty. No bodies. No tables. No files. Only one chair stood in the middle of the room. My father was sitting in it. He looked older than I remembered. His hair was gray, and his face was thin. I stopped several feet away. Dad? He looked at me. You shouldn't have taken this job. What happened to you? He looked toward the cameras mounted in the corner. They don't record what happens here. Then what do they record? He looked at me. What's going to happen? I remembered Eleanor's warning. Why did she keep appearing? She was trying to stop them. Stop who? My father didn't answer. Then the lights turned on. Every camera in the room activated at once. The monitors showed me standing beside my father. But the timestamp was different. October 17, 2029. I stared at the screen. 20 years in the future. Then I saw something else. On the monitor, an older version of me was sitting in the security room. He was watching the same footage. Behind him stood Eleanor. She looked exactly the same. My father whispered, "Now you understand." I turned toward him. What am I supposed to do? He pointed at the door. Don't let them put you on camera. The lights went out. I heard footsteps. When they came back on, my father was gone. I searched the hospital for hours. I never found him. The police arrived before sunrise, but they found no basement, no second morgue, and no evidence that my father had ever been there. I resigned the next morning. Before leaving, I checked the security monitors one final time. Every camera showed an empty hospital. Except camera C-14. Eleanor was standing there. She looked directly at me. Then she smiled. I walked away. I never returned to that hospital. But 6 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was the same VHS tape. I played it once. The footage showed the security room from 1989. My father was sitting at the desk. Eleanor stood behind him. Then the picture changed. It showed me sitting in that same chair. But the date on the screen was 2029. Eleanor walked toward me. She leaned close to the camera and whispered 3 words. "Your turn now."